Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own All Secrets Keep or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by Lisbeth_1, and you can find the link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Celine.
All Secrets Keep, Chapter 15. It became easier after that to deal with having to be apart from Sarah. Tally still missed her more than she'd ever missed anyone before, but knowing that Sarah still wanted to be with her, no matter what, made it easier to get through any stretch of days that they were unable to see each other. During the day, out in the open, they were General Alder and Cadet Craven. Their paths never crossed much, and when they did, it was with the briefest exchange of smiles, and in Tally's case, a red face. But behind closed doors, whenever they managed to steal a moment away together, or when Tally started sneaking into Sarah's room in the General's quarters at night, they could once again be Sarah and Tally, instead of General and Cadet. Sarah had to admit to herself that she felt a little like what she imagined a teenager might feel like, hiding a relationship from their parents. Tally had started sneaking into her bedroom every night after lights out, and then sneaking back out in the morning before first bell. But after a few close calls of almost being spotted by Petra in the morning, they decided it was best for Tally to only come on the weekends. Both Petra and General Clary, the only other two occupants of the General's quarters, usually left on weekends, having both a home and a family to go back to. Sarah, in all her years at Fort Salem, never had a house or home outside of the walls of the base after it was built. It was easier for her, with all the biddies in tow, to have simply remained on campus, where there were dorms large enough to house them all. Tally had asked her one night if she ever thought about getting a place off base, now that she no longer required any biddies, but Sarah had brushed it aside. Fort Salem had been her home for centuries, and it would remain so. It was almost the end of November, the temperatures dropping lower each day, and yet that did nothing to stop training exercises from being outside in the cold. Raelle and Abigail, both being used to chillier temperatures, didn't seem to mind it as much as Tally did. Her teeth chattered together almost obnoxiously as they walked back towards their dorms. She didn't know it was possible for a person to be freezing and so sweaty at the same time. Lost in her thoughts of dreaming about a warm shower and an even warmer bed, a sharp poke to her side had her jumping, scowling as she turned to face Raelle, who had just jabbed her in the ribs. Raelle simply raised her eyebrows and motioned with her head to somewhere behind Tally's shoulder. Tally turned her head, and suddenly all thoughts of how cold and sweaty she was disappeared from her brain. Sarah and Anacostia were walking down the path towards them, presumably passing by them on the way to Petra's office. As the two women passed by, Tally's eyes glued to Sarah. Sarah looked over towards the three girls and, with an extremely casual demeanor, said, "Good afternoon, cadets." It sounded like nothing more than a standard greeting, but she barely looked at Abigail and Raelle as she spoke. "Afternoon, Sarah," Abigail replied smugly. Raelle smacked her on the back of the head. Anacostia snorted. quickly covering her mouth with her hand as Sarah shot Abigail a warning glare. Abigail quickly straightened, the smile disappearing from her face. Ma'am. Hey, Abs, maybe don't try to antagonize my girlfriend? Tally blushed furiously as soon as Sarah and Anacostia were out of earshot. Sorry, Abigail rolled her eyes. I thought it would be funny. Oh, it was hilarious, Rael corrected. If looks could do work, I'm pretty sure you'd be a smear on the ground right now. Yeah, very funny, shitbird, Abigail grumbled. If looks could do work, I'm pretty sure the entire campus would be scandalized with the amount of times that Tally has undressed Alder with her eyes. Tally, who had been staring at Sarah's ass as she walked away, snapped her eyes back to Abigail. I don't do that. Abigail smirked, starting to head back towards the dorms again. Sure you don't, Tell. Sure you don't. Hello, my love. Tally whirled around in shock at the gentle sound of Sarah's voice. She was in her dorm, alone, both Abigail and Rael with their significant others, and Sarah was standing in her doorway, a smile tugging at her lips. Hi, she said breathlessly, a smile easily appearing on her face. What are you doing here? She was glad to see Sarah, of course, but never before had Sarah shown up to her coven. Sarah's mouth quirked with a larger smile, and she stepped easily into the room, Tally automatically walking forward to meet her. Sarah took both of Tally's hands with her own, looking down at her. Am I not allowed to come and say hello to the woman I love? She asked softly. Tally squeezed Sarah's hands, flushing. No matter how many times she had heard Sarah say that she loved her, it still caused her to blush, and probably always would. Sarah found it terribly endearing. Of course you are, Tally bit her lip. I'm just surprised you came here. Sarah hummed in response, glancing around the room. You are alone, yes? Tally's heart stuttered in her chest. Yes. Sarah's intense blue gaze returned to Tally's. Good. She leaned down, pressing her lips softly to Tally's. Tally dropped Sarah's hands to wind them around her neck, melting eagerly into Sarah's touch. Hey, Tally, have you seen my... Oh, goddess. Rael's horrified voice had Sarah and Tally pulling apart, Sarah straightening as she turned around to look at Rael, who was standing in the doorway, red-faced. I'm so sorry, General, Rael rushed out, staring at the door jamb. I didn't know. Her blue eyes flicked to Sarah's face for a split second. The door was open, she finished lamely. Sarah cleared her throat, taking a step away from Tally, but she took one of Tally's hands in her own as she did. That's all right, caller. Tally didn't know how Sarah wasn't embarrassed. Her own face felt like it was going to combust into flames at any moment, and Rael's didn't look any better, unable to meet the eyes of either woman currently standing in the room. You can come in, caller, Sarah spoke again, just a hint of amusement in her voice. This is, after all, your room. Right, Rael muttered. She looked down at the ground as she entered the room, skirting past the two women to get to her desk, busying herself with a disorganization of papers and books that she had scattered on it. She couldn't remember what she had originally been looking for. I just came here to say goodbye to Tally. Sarah's explanation had both cadets looking at her with different expressions, Rael with surprise, and Tally with confusion and a hint of sadness. Goodbye. Tally's voice mirrored the emotions on her face. Where are you going? Rael quickly turned back around. This seemed like a somewhat private conversation, and she tried to make it seem like she wasn't paying attention, even with her ears straining to listen. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Sarah turn back to Tally, running a gentle hand down Tally's arm. I have to go to The Hague with Petra. The other generals want to discuss what to do next about the Camarilla, and Petra wants me to be there. Tally frowned. Okay, do you know how long you'll be gone? She did her best to sound like she wasn't whining. She knew that this was an important matter, one that Sarah was an integral part of. But that didn't mean she had to like the fact that Sarah was leaving the country. Not long. Sarah's voice was soft, far softer than Rael had ever heard it before. Just a few days. When do you leave? Tally couldn't keep the slight whine out of her voice that time, and Rael chanced a further glance over to them. It was like they had forgotten she was in the room. Tally's hands were gripping Sarah's waist, curled into the bottom of her jacket. Sarah had both of her hands on Tally's shoulders, and she had such an open, soft expression on her face that Rael could hardly believe her eyes. She quickly averted her eyes again, certain she was intruding on a private moment, even though Sarah had been the one to invite her into the room. Tonight. Tonight? Rael didn't miss the way that Tally's voice cracked in disbelief, and evidently neither did Sarah. I'm sorry, darling. Rael's eyes widened slightly at the term of affection so easily slipping from Sarah's mouth. I wish I could have given you more of a heads up, but I only just found out myself, Sarah apologized. I came to find you as soon as I could. That's okay, Tally said, sounding like it was very much not okay. I understand. I will come find you as soon as I come back, and am able to, Sarah promised with a squeeze of her hand to Tally's shoulder. Okay. Tally's answer was a quick whisper. I love you. Sarah's voice was lowered to a whisper as well, but she may as well have shouted it. Both Tally and Rael turned red. Rael hardly able to believe what she was hearing. Tally telling her that Sarah loved her was one thing. It was something else entirely to hear General Alder so easily, so intimately tell Tally herself. She heard Tally sniff. I love you too, Sarah. She saw Sarah lean in towards Tally, and immediately pivoted so her back was completely to them. She did not need to see Tally kissing Alder for a second time that day. There was about 30 seconds of silence, and then Sarah spoke again, at a normal volume this time, scaring Rael. Goodbye, Cadet Collar. Rael jumped slightly, spinning around to see Sarah watching her from the doorway with an amused expression on her face. Yep. Goodbye, ma'am, she stammered out awkwardly. Sarah smirked slightly before glancing one last time at Tally, and then she was gone. Rael felt stunned. Wow, was all she said. Tally blinked, slowly turning away from looking at the doorway where Sarah had last been. What? I have never seen her like that before with anyone. It was like she was a completely different person. Rael looked at Tally in disbelief. Is she like that all the time with you? Tally flushed. Like what? Rael's nose crinkled. Like all soft and hands-on and darling. Rael dropped her voice down into an exaggerated imitation of Alder's. Yes, Tally bit on her lip to keep from smiling. I told you that she cares about me. And I believed you, Rael was quick to assure her, but I didn't realize how sweet she was. There was a pause. Please don't tell her I said that, she said with a grimace. Tally burst out laughing, and she shook her head. Don't worry. Somehow I think that would just embarrass her more than it would you. Abigail dragged Tally and Rael out to Salem town to go Christmas shopping that weekend. It had been 4 days since Sarah and Petra had left for The Hague, and Tally was becoming more anxious with every day that passed. Abigail eventually decided she'd had enough of Tally's worrying, and forced both her and Rael to come with her into Salem. My mom wants to know what you guys want for Christmas. Abigail said it so casually, causing both her sisters to look at her with mild surprise. They were walking down the main street of Salem, all huddled together to try to keep warm. It was a dreary, grey, late afternoon with snow flurries falling lightly through the air, melting as soon as they touched the ground. The streets were practically empty for once, the residents of Salem town not wanting to venture out into the cold. "Your mom wants to buy us Christmas gifts," Telly asked with a shiver, pressing up closer to Rael. "That's what I said, isn't it?" Abigail nudged her playfully. "She also said you guys are welcome to come to the winter estate for Christmas if you like, but I told her you guys might already have plans. Yeah, Scylla and I are gonna spend Christmas with my dad in the session." Rael's voice was muffled by the scarf she had pulled up over her face. "That's what I figured," Abigail nodded. She nudged Telly again. "What about you? Wanna come be a bellwether for Christmas?" "That does sound nice," Telly admitted. "I haven't talked to my mom since she hung up on me, so it's not like I would be going home for Christmas anyway." "What about Alder?" Rael's question had Telly turning to look at her properly. "Are you not going to spend Christmas with her?" "I don't know," Telly answered truthfully. She was grateful her cheeks were already red from the wind as she felt herself blush. "We haven't talked about it yet." "Oh yeah, about that," Abigail laughed. "My mom also told me, Telly, that if you wanted, you could bring your girlfriend with you." Telly's eyes bulged, and her head whipped back towards Abigail. "What?" "Well, she obviously doesn't know it's Alder," Abigail said with an eye roll. "She's very curious, though. She even asked me if I knew who defiled your neck with all those hickeys the other week. So if you do come for Christmas, don't be surprised if you get bombarded with questions." Telly groaned, burying her face into her gloved hands as Rael snorted next to her. "Oh, that's perfect. Imagine the look on your mom's face if Telly tells her that her girlfriend is coming over for Christmas, and then Alder shows up at the door." Rael's scarf slid down her face as she let out a laugh. Abigail burst into laughter. "I think that would send my mother to an early grave. Like, she would just die of shock on the spot." "I'm ignoring you both," Telly exclaimed, lifting her head from her hands. "Just ignoring you. Can't hear you anymore." "Aw, come on, Telly." Rael looped her eyes through Telly's, leaning her head on her arm. "You know we love you." Abigail mirrored Rael's actions. "Yeah, darling, we love you." Telly groaned loudly, shoving her sisters away from her as they both laughed loudly. "You guys are the worst." They didn't actually get much shopping done. They stopped for hot chocolate at one point, Rael and Abigail getting into a mock argument about how much whipped cream was too much whipped cream, when they noticed Telly wasn't following them anymore. They turned around to find her staring into the window of a jewelry store, breath fogging up the window slightly. "You all right, Tal?" Rael called after her. "This bracelet is gorgeous." Telly motioned for her sisters to come see what she was looking at. She felt Rael and Abigail appear on either side of her. "Come, look at it." "Wow, that's really pretty," she heard Abigail murmur in agreement next to her. It was a silver bracelet, 2 sapphires bracketing an inscription in mother tongue that Telly couldn't quite read. "Ray, what does that say?" She felt Rael lean in closer, peering over Telly's shoulder. "My love, my light, my life." Telly's gaze dropped to the price tag, and she choked on the sharp inhale of cold air that it caused her to take. "Goddess, I was thinking about getting it for myself, but I think that is way more than I could ever justify spending." She gazed at the bracelet forlornly. "It's really pretty, though." Behind Telly, Abigail's eyes noticed something further up the street, and she looked up, a wry smile appearing on her face. She quietly nudged Rael as Telly continued to look at the jewelry in the display window. Rael followed Abigail's gaze. So, Telly, when does Alder get back from The Hague?" Rael asked with a casual cough. "Oh," Telly's nose crinkled as she continued to look in the window. "I don't know, honestly. She said she would only be gone a few days, but it's already been like 4 days, and I don't know how much longer a few is supposed to be. It's not like I can just call her up at The Hague and ask her. I hope it's soon, though. I can't wait to see her again. I think you'll be seeing her sooner than you think, Tally. Abigail was unable to keep the teasing tone out of her voice. Huh? Tally finally pulled back from the window, turning to look at Abigail. What do you mean? With a wordless smile, Abigail reached out and grabbed Tally by the shoulders, spinning her in place. Tally yelped slightly at the movement, but the sound was lost in her throat as she came to a standstill and her eyes landed on Sarah, walking down the street towards them. Oh, she breathed out, a smile appearing on her face before she even realized it. She took a step forward, then halted, turning to look back at her sisters. Do you care if I— For God's sake, Tal, Raelle laughed, giving her a small shove. Go! Tally didn't need to be told twice. Any other time she would have hesitated. They were in public, after all. But Sarah was walking towards her, smiling, and the streets of Salem were empty, and Tally couldn't bring herself to care that they were in public as she tore off down the street towards Sarah. Her body collided into Sarah's sturdy, warm frame, and she heard Sarah laugh slightly as she was lifted off her feet, Sarah gently swaying her before setting her back down again. Tally leaned her body against Sarah's, her arms wrapped around her waist as she looked up at Sarah with an adoring grin on her face. Sarah smiled down at her, bringing up a hand to gently stroke Tally's cheek. "Did you miss me?" she asked softly, teasing. "Only every single day." Tally desperately wanted to lean in and close the distance between her and Sarah, but she also wasn't sure how much public affection Sarah was willing to put on display. She was counting herself lucky that she was even in Sarah's arms at the moment, out in the street where anyone could pass by. "Me too." Sarah's tone was still soft, but she lifted her eyes to look over Tally's head at Abigail and Raelle, who were standing further down the street, watching them. "Do you think your unit will mind too terribly much if I steal you away for the rest of the day?" Tally turned slightly in Sarah's arms, looking back at her sisters. Abigail rolled her eyes, but there was a small smile on her face, and Raelle just grinned, waving at Tally before looping her arm through Abigail's, already turning and walking away. Tally turned back to Sarah, breathless and giddy. "Somehow I think they'll survive without me." They didn't even make it back to Sarah's room. It was almost completely dark now, the moon that was lighting up the sky partially hidden by the trees of the forest that surrounded Fort Salem. Tally hadn't thought much of it when Sarah had taken her on a path through the woods, assuming it was either a shortcut or just the safest way to get back to base without being seen by anyone. But then Sarah had grabbed her and pressed her up against the nearest tree. Bark dug slightly into Tally's back, softened only slightly by the thickness of the jacket that she wore, but she couldn't bring herself to care when Sarah stepped into Tally's personal space, pinning Tally's hips to the tree with her own. Her hands trailed lightly down Tally's arms, breath ghosting over Tally's lips. Tally immediately reached out for Sarah, hands grabbing at Sarah's shoulders to steady herself. "Tally," Sarah's voice was low as she looked down at Tally's lips. Her hands dropped to the waist of Tally's pants, toying with them. "I'm going to need you to be very quiet for me. Can you do that?" Tally's breath caught in her throat when Sarah looked back up at her. Her eyes were dark, burning with a desire that had a heat shooting through Tally's body, despite the cold air around them. "Yes." "Good girl." Tally was barely able to hold back the moan that involuntarily rose in her throat at Sarah's words. But Sarah had told her to be quiet, and she'd be damned if she was going to disobey her. Her body still shuddered nonetheless, and Sarah smirked at her reaction before leaning in and pressing a searing kiss to Tally's lips. This wasn't like the first time they had sex. The first time they had been soft and gentle, and Sarah had touched her like she was made of glass, like Tally might have broken if she pushed too hard. This time, Sarah was kissing Tally with such a fierceness that it stole all the breath from her lungs, and left her spine tingling and her head spinning. This time, when Sarah undid the button on Tally's pants and slid her chilled fingers down, slipping underneath the band of Tally's panties, Tally already slick and waiting, Sarah didn't hesitate to sink 2 fingers inside of her. Tally threw her head back against the tree, squeezing her eyes shut and biting down on her lip, hard, so she wouldn't make a sound. The noises from Sarah thrusting into her were almost obscene, and when Sarah, even with limited room to move her hand, pressed the heel of her palm into Tally's clit, giving her something to grind on, Tally had to choke back a moan. She could already feel herself hurtling towards the edge, the pressure between her legs building with every motion of Sarah's hand, and just when she was about to clench around Sarah's fingers in a soundless cry, Sarah's motions slowed. Tally's eyes flew open with a stuttering gasp, and her fingertips gripped Sarah's shoulders almost hard enough to bruise. Not so fast. Sarah was staring at her as Tally struggled to regain her senses. Sarah's hand still working inside of Tally, but much slower than it had been. "You're doing so good, but you're not allowed to come yet, okay?" Tally's eyes were wide, but she nodded her head feverishly. "Okay." Sarah leaned back in to capture Tally's mouth with hers again, as she began to fuck Tally faster again. She could hear each stuttered cry and choked back moan that Tally held back in a desperate attempt to keep quiet, heat surging through her with every one, both at the noises themselves and the fact that Tally was still keeping quiet, simply because Sarah had told her to. That only served to spur Sarah on, quickening her pace and curling her fingers inside of Tally. The sensation had Tally pulling away from Sarah's lips to throw her head back against the tree. Sarah following her forward to drop her head to Tally's shoulder. She desperately wished she had been able to take Tally's top off, to kiss and worship Tally's breasts like she had been able to the first time, but it was too cold. Tally's warm breath visible in the night air as she panted quietly against Sarah. Tally shuddered once, twice, underneath Sarah again, as Sarah continued to curl her fingers with each slick thrust into her, but then stopped tensing. Each thrust into her had a quiet, keening whimper leaving her throat, getting higher with each stroke of Sarah's fingers. Her hands scrabbled at Sarah's back, throat raw with the cold, harsh air that she sucked in with each breath. "Sarah," Tally whimpered, squeezing her eyes shut. "Sarah, please, I need to." Sarah's head snapped up to look at Tally, who looked like she was fighting with herself, every muscle tensed, whimpering. She looked so close, so fucking close, and yet Sarah realized with another rush of heat through her body that despite everything, despite how hard Sarah was fucking her at the moment, Tally wasn't letting herself come, all because Sarah had told her that she wasn't allowed to. "Oh, Tally," Sarah breathed out. "It's all right, love. You can come for me." The words had barely finished leaving Sarah's mouth before Tally arched into her, and she clenched down hard around Sarah's fingers, body shuddering violently. A loud, desperate-sounding moan left Tally's mouth, and Sarah's hand, the one currently not shoved down Tally's pants, instantly flew up to cover her mouth. Sarah slowed her movements inside Tally, waiting until the younger woman stopped shuddering and had collapsed back against the tree, before slowly sliding out of her. Tally's eyes fluttered open at the feeling, and Sarah lowered her hand from Tally's mouth, allowing her to gasp quietly into the cold night air. "That was incredible," Tally breathed out, hand moving to clutch at Sarah's arm. Sarah leaned in to kiss Tally, slow and sweet, before pulling back, loving the way that she had Tally reeling slightly again. "You are incredible," Sarah corrected, nuzzling her nose against Tally's ear, pressing a kiss to her witch's mark. Tally's grip tightened on Sarah. "Do you remember what you were going to do last time, before I told you that I wanted your clothes instead?" Sarah just hummed in response, lightly kissing Tally's neck. "Can we—" Tally's voice tilted slightly upward at Sarah's actions. "Can we try that?" Sarah chuckled, a low vibration against Tally's neck, and she pulled back. "Yes, but we would have to go inside for that. It's too cold out here to take any of your clothes off. I don't need you freezing to death on me." She turned to step away from Tally, but Tally grabbed her hand, stopping her. "No, Sarah, Tally flushed furiously, looking away for a moment as Sarah turned to look back at her, confused. "I want to try that on you." Oh. A sudden rush of desire and heat coursed through Sarah's veins, locking her in place as she stared at the younger witch in front of her. Tally was looking at her nervously. "If that's okay, Yes." Sarah abruptly cut her off, squeezing her hand as she spoke. "Yes, that is more than okay." Something flashed in Tally's eyes, and a small grin appeared on her face, and it was her turn to step forward, grabbing Sarah's face and kissing her deeply. She pulled back, Sarah's thoughts still stuttering around in her brain at Tally's words. "Well then, Sarah," Tally was still grinning, stepping away from Sarah as she kept a hold on her hand, tugging the older woman along the path they had previously been walking on. "Will you let me take you to bed?"
Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.